take the coat out of the way too?
All right, and you're going to be sitting on that side? It's up to you. You tell me. So you wish to be there? Okay, no problem.
The coat from out behind.
Can I remove the coat? Yeah, please. Okay. What did I just unplug? I feel like I unplugged something. Okay, whatever. I'm sure it wasn't anything super important. I'll just put that there. It's probably the keyboard. That's what we unplugged. Okay. All right, and then we full screen this.
Did you get someone?
Okay. Can we turn the camera on the phone?
Right now,
Oh, it is on. Oh.
what is there?
Water starting soon.
Yeah.
And then there's
Okay. I know. We're unmuted actually. Okay, we're gonna start now. I'm just gonna. All right. Okay. Great. So we are live now to YouTube and Twitter. This is our 8th class. No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay,
Yep, we're good. No problem. All right, so this is, I think, our 8th class, right? So, yeah, this is our 8th class in the Vega for Congress class series. And as usual, we begin with a little bit of a briefing that I give. And my job gets very easy in introducing these things because we have the Friday morning International Peace Coalition calls. So that's where I get my briefings from. And I'll just keep it point blank with you. I'll repeat something that Scott Ritter had said today, which was that we all could have been dead September 14th. 6 days ago, we could have all been dead if on September 13th, Keir Starmer and Joe Biden had allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles into Russia. And one of the things that Scott Ritter had emphasized was that Putin is not bluffing when he says he would be at war with NATO if the long-range missiles were used from Ukraine to Russia. And that is where we find ourselves now. Thankfully, there was no shift in foreign policy, according to the collective Biden administration. No shift in policy with the UK, except that the UK says that this is definitely something they want to do. They just need to continue considering it with other international allies and partners. What does this mean? This means we are nowhere near the safe zone. We just happen to press the pause button, and maybe we bought ourselves, at best, a few weeks, but realistically only a few days. And if people don't decide to act now, then all will be lost. One of the things that my campaign has been doing is we have been outside of the United Nations promoting UN General Resolution 377. This would give the United Nations General Assembly the right to act as the Security Council in the event that the Security Council fails to act in a timely manner to prevent or stop catastrophe, acts of genocide, or war, just like what we see going on in Gaza right now. On top of that, we have been getting out this testimony from Dr. Mark Perlmutter. And what happened was when we were at the United Nations, just the day after the United Nations overwhelmingly voted, I think 142 to 46 and 12 abstentions to declare Israel's occupation of Palestine illegal, and it stripped Israel of its right to, quote unquote, self-defense, because how can an occupying power actually have self-defense? This was a victory in the eyes of the world. And so we were out there giving out this testimony of a doctor who was in Gaza for 3 weeks, reporting on this harrowing experience that he and other doctors and aid workers experience, fearing for their lives every day, but worst of all, seeing the slaughter of children when 90% of his patients were children, and there was no anesthesia involved in a lot of these surgeries, and the people he would treat would be dead in the next days or hours after getting treated. And he experienced this for 3 weeks, and he was in touch with the Israeli embassy. And sometimes they would respond to him, and most of the time they wouldn't. He didn't even know if he was going to leave Gaza alive or not. But he did, and he came back to tell us his experience. This is a doctor who was in many different war zones or disaster zones, whether it was after Hurricane Katrina, whether it was after the earthquakes in Haiti, or Ground Zero on 9/11. He was there treating people, and none of those things summed up together amount at all to what he experienced in Gaza. And what we found was that the United Nations security guards were preventing people, delegates, from walking into the building with our leaflet, with this testimony, and in support of Resolution 377. And when we asked the security guards why they were confiscating it from the hands of delegates, they just said, we were instructed to, and there is no comment. Why doesn't the United Nations want to know this testimony? Why doesn't the United Nations want to consider Dr. Mark Perlmutter's testimony? But more importantly, why doesn't the U.S. Congress actually want to listen to what Dr. Mark Perlmutter has to say? Perlmutter sent a letter to the Biden administration, to the Congress, to the Senate. He sent it to the Bundestag. He sent it to the upper and lower chambers of the UK House of Parliament. And thankfully, his written testimony, along with 99 other doctors and aid workers who were in Gaza, were responsible in stopping the arms sales of the UK to Israel, at least until the International Court of Justice comes back with their decision. But our congressmen and our senators and our collective Biden administration, instead of dealing with the truth of the situation, choose to hide their heads and be complicit with genocide, rather than owning up to the fact that there is now a policy of mass slaughter and mass death. So the question is, what do you actually replace it with? And I ask this question every week. Why is it that the Vietnam protests didn't work in stopping all wars forever? Why didn't the Iraq protests work in stopping all wars forever? Because the absence of war is not peace. What actually is peace? And peace is an active process that must be pursued as frivolously as the people who are in charge now pursue war. But the only way you can do that is if you have a culture that wants that demands that of its society, to actually create and reproduce peace. And peace can only exist through beauty. I think Megan will tell us a little bit about that today. So go ahead, Megan.
So last week, Dennis raised the issue of culture. Culture generally, American culture specifically, in the person of Edgar Poe. And what came up in his presentation was the effort on the part of the fascists to put Hitler into power to make sure that nothing like a Franklin Roosevelt United States, or you could say Poe's America, ever rose again to challenge their grip and their hold on world affairs. And the vehicle for that wasn't armies in the streets. That hadn't worked. The vehicle for that was culture. It was the design of the top 40. It was the 3-minute pop song. It was the denouncement of the authoritarian personality. It was the design of music to contain a heavy, repetitive beat to induce, in the words of Theodore Adorno, to induce a state of catatonia leading to necrophilia. That was the so-called insurance policy of this oligarchy that Jose was just describing, that's created this, not only created the situation in Gaza, but the seeming inability of the population to do something about it, the American population to do something about it. The design of a mass culture of insanity, which has given up all at once its commitment to the idea that human beings are made in the image of God. To create that kind of mass culture and disseminate it through mass media. That's what happened at the end of World War II. And that's exactly what Jose was referencing in the anti-Vietnam War and anti-Iraq War protests. That's what we're up against. So we'll get back to that. What I wanted to open up a discussion on tonight is the economic value of culture. What role exactly does culture play in economic progress? Does it matter what people choose to do with their leisure time? And I think, that people in this room might have various ideas on that, but try to think of what, if you went out on the street or observed most people's behavior, probably wouldn't want to, but if you could see people in their private time and what they do with their private time, would they agree with that statement? Or would they agree with that question? What would they think of that question? Does the music that you listen to matter? So I want to start with the question of successful survival. And this is something that Lyndon LaRouche wrote about many places, but mainly in Defense of Common Sense. And he uses the image of a swimmer who's out in the water about to drown. And at the very last moment, he's saved. Now that lucky person has just experienced momentary survival. And the question, and I would say, I think we can think back on many times in human history when the human species or part of the human species experienced momentary survival. You could think of the intervention and the work of people in Italy and Europe to pull Europe out of the Dark Ages and spark the Renaissance. The presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, and so forth and so on. These things seem almost lucky. Thank God there was a Roosevelt, right? But the question LaRouche raises is, how do we ensure not just a string of moments of survival, pulling back from the brink, but how do we ensure successful survival, perpetual survival? Now, this is something I'd asserted a few weeks back, that the human population potentially has limitless potential for population growth and progress. There's potentially no limit to the growth and development of the human species. A couple weeks later, Jason raised the question of resources and the myth of finite, limited resources, and the fact that to overcome the seeming limits in that way, or what might be temporary limits, humanity has to make new revolutionary discoveries of new universal principles. So in that sense, the key to perpetual progress is perpetual discovery. Now the question is, and this I think is kind of fun to think about, will that always be possible? And you might say, oh yeah, sure, right, we're pretty smart. Will humanity ever run into a problem, a paradox, a discovery that has to be made that we can't overcome? Is there a limit to that? And I think it also is an interesting question because it makes you think, well, sitting here today in 2024, we can think of some of the next breakthroughs that are on the horizon, breakthroughs that need to be made maybe in nuclear fission and nuclear fusion technology, right? We kind of know what that is. We haven't made the breakthroughs yet, but we know what we're dealing with. We can think a little bit further down the line about matter-antimatter reactions. We have some sense of the potential of that. What about the next discoveries? How do we today, who aren't going to live, be alive in a couple hundred years, how can we die with the confidence that the society we leave behind will be able to make those discoveries? And we don't even know what those discoveries are. We really can't have a concept of that. So what you're talking about is, how do we put society or the culture into a mode in which it will always be capable of doing that? It will always be capable of making that leap, even if we don't know what that leap is supposed to look like. And actually, let me open it up. What do you guys think? What's necessary about society to make sure that it could always make that next scientific breakthrough?
Education.
Okay. Sure. Can you say more?
Well, people have an innate ability to understand the world, but if they're uneducated or miseducated, then they can't participate in history.
Yeah, I agree with that. Any other thoughts?
Elimination of poverty, improving people's living standards.
Why is that necessary? I mean, I agree, I want that to happen, but why is it necessary in the face of this question?
Well, I mean, if people are struggling day to day just to make sure they have an adequate amount of food that they can pay rent, it's, not often the case that they'll be able to focus on, their own education or improving themselves or making important discoveries. So it would be necessary to ensure they're able to do that.
Okay, yeah, so freeing a greater and greater, up to 100% of the population from those kinds of concerns, so they can actually participate in that. Yeah, I'd agree with that. What if they don't want to?
You can't force them to.
You can't force people to make a discovery. You can't command it. Shelley talks about this in his A Defense of Poetry. You can't command somebody to write a poem, right? You write poetry, right? Write a good poem, right? You can't imprison someone until they make a discovery, right? It has to come from an inspiration. There has to be a certain passion driving that. How do you ensure that?
Well, once societies in the 50s to the 60s, workforces was developed where you go to work at 8 to 5 and get off. And if there's culture stuff going on, or could be created, that you have a block that you made enough money, enough, your insurance, everything family got settled in a 8 to 5 in the afternoon, and once that is a commitment, I think the other could be developed, where the father and the mother has the capability to really think about other things, and if there's in the community poetry being read, or or music, then they maybe would look at it as something that gave them beauty, rather than working 9 hours, 10 hours a day. You could have that moment. You can't make them, but it could be very easily, being the human mind really seeks for that.
I'm not going to say it's the best way. It's actually probably the worst way. But what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, I let my procrastination and my, I let things get out of hand until I need to change. And that provokes me, that lights my ass on fire to actually make a discovery and actually get something done. I mean, it's definitely not the best way, but it's going to happen.
So we need procrastination and we need it now.
But I say this out of somebody who's I wish I had more willingness to do the right thing.
Did we need the discoveries of the nucleus in 1900?
There was, the nucleus?
Yeah.
I'm thinking Lavoisier and
Sure.
microbiology. I mean, that was definitely, so many women were dying and from birth, right? From giving birth. Surgeons not cleaning their tools. I mean, it didn't necessitate it, but it points a finger at the paradox. Like, why are people dying? Oh, nope. It's after you get surgery. Whatever happens, paradoxes develop when things aren't in harmony. The more discord there is, the easier it is to spot what's wrong. And I think that's also what Shelley might be talking about when, in revolutionary times, the population is just able to understand more than, you would think, because these paradoxes are just evident. I mean, it's so clear that we're in an oligarchy right now.
So the question is, when you get to those moments, how do you ensure that the population is actually able to respond?
Oh,
So that's it. I mean, that's what we're getting at. And that's partly where we get to the economic value of art, right? And of beauty or love of humanity, which are all very much related ideas. So I think contrary to what's portrayed in popular culture in these really stupid movies, and there are like 500 different versions of the same movie, which is like the evil society has the best technology. You know, it's like the idea that like this evil, society is going to have all this completely advanced technology and the aliens are going to come and blow up the earth, right? So, but it's not possible. You cannot have a bestial society which is degenerate in its art, degenerate in its tastes, which embraces ugliness, banality, or things much worse on the one hand, but on the other hand continues to make scientific progress. It cannot happen. And it can't happen for the reason that Albert Einstein is very much familiar with, which is that the scientist in the mode of discovery is in a state of mind and also a state of emotion, which is the exact same thing as the artist in the process of composition or performance, which is a kind of recomposition of beautiful art. It's one and the same state of mind. So if you degrade the culture, you degrade the other side too. So keeping that and this question in mind, which I don't think we've totally answered, let's get back to the question of successful survival from the standpoint of LaRouche's economic metric that he developed, potential relative population density. Meaning, what could the population density be, right? Land, the suitability of land areas being relative, were we to apply all of the advancements in technology that we have today. In terms of successful survival, the question is potential relative population density increasing over time? And is it increasing at an accelerating rate? That's successful survival. That's when that happens. So let's look, could you pull up, Jose, the slide? I'll tell you which one. That's the one. Oh, yeah. So this is remade from LaRouche's economic textbook from 1983. So you wish to learn all about economics. And this is affectionately known as the bar diagram. So this is representative of the process of production and consumption of the entire society. So when we think of production and consumption, we're not thinking in terms of money or anything like that, but all physical market baskets of consumption. So for example, C, the bottom part of this bar, is all of the capital goods that are consumed in the process of production, all of the machinery, all of the transport infrastructure, all of the fuel, right? Everything that goes into the productive process. V is everything consumed in the maintenance of the households of those operatives that actually do the producing. C and V, well, C is responsible for the entire goods output of the entire society. So LaRouche calls C and V the energy of the system, that which is necessary to keep the production process going, to keep us in the process of production. Anything produced which is above the energy of the system, which is more than what's required for C and V, that's surplus. That's S. But out of surplus, we have to support what he calls what's called D, overhead, right? That's people who aren't directly involved in the process of production. So some overhead is good, and some of the overhead is not so good. So overhead might include children, might include teachers, doctors, singers. It might also include, at this point, Wall Street bankers, whom we might want to reemploy, or drug dealers, people who are what LaRouche calls economic waste. Anything above that is true surplus, free energy. He borrows the term from thermodynamics. So the free energy is the most important part of the economy. It's that which LaRouche says over time, from economic cycle to economic cycle, C is growing, V is growing,
Well, V is growing, C is growing relative to V, D is also growing. But S prime, the true surplus, the free energy of your economy has to be growing at a higher rate. Now that's a really interesting question. How does that happen? Why? Why is that so important? What do you do with true economic profit? Now, physical profit, right? You might keep your people in the process of education for a little bit longer. You might be able to do that. You might have put people into higher, more specialized training. You might invest into building a fusion reactor. That'd be good. Research and development. You might build more opera houses. You might train more opera singers. Today, and for a long, long time in the United States, we have had no S prime. Zero. None. No physical economic profit, period. We've covered it up. We've covered it up with money. We've stolen from other countries. We've used cheap labor from less developed countries, and we haven't invested in the infrastructure there. We've created the illusion of advance through financial profit, which has been enabled by the swindles that have deregulated the financial system. But there's been no net physical profit for many decades. So where has that free energy gone? What happened to it? With what has it been consumed? Now, obviously, I think everybody here has experienced the fact that people today are having to work more and more to bring home less and less, right? That's just a fact, and that's partly where it's gone. The other thing we're going to look at is what are people doing with their leisure time? That's another part of it. So you can go to the next slide. I meant to remake this. These are old figures and kind of shocking colors, but I didn't have time. So this is comparing the 2018 revenue of the sports industry in the United States, which in 2018 was $71 billion, to the amount of money that the US will invest into ITER, which is the International Fusion Project in France, from 2007 to 2025. Okay? So just take that in for a second. Next one. Okay, so this is the video game industry in 2018, which is $138 billion in revenue. And I actually got a more up-to-date number here. Let me find it. Oh yeah, in 2022 is $347 billion. Globally, yeah. And you compare that to, so that was 2022. In 2022, the global government investment in space, now that includes China, country who's actually doing a lot, right, was 103 billion. So I'm just kind of give you it's just that's just a shadow, a little perspective. But to stay for a moment on the issue of video games, how many hours per week do you guys think the average 20-year-old plays video games?
In the United States?
Yeah, in the United States, yeah.
The average 20-year-old?
Mm-hmm.
30 hours. 35 hours.
80. It's kind of high, but I think there are a lot of people who do. It wasn't so easy to find figures for this, but it seems like 18 to 24-year-olds, 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the U.S. play 6 or more hours per week, with the majority being in the 7 to 10 hour per week range, right? 66% of Gen Z respondents who responded to one study I was looking at, 66% call themselves gamers. Just to kind of give you a perspective, but as is not a secret, what are these things that people are spending their time in there? Some people it is 30 hours a week, right? What are these things? They have history. Number one part of the history is war games, which were very popular among the British war aristocracy at the turn of the century, including people like H.G. Wells and people who went on to design The Social Network. But also the other root of video games is the military, who invented the first-person shooter video game because they were disappointed with the kill ratios from World War II.
and wanted to find a way to overcome the natural human inhibition to kill another person. And so through psychological studies, a lot involving British intelligence and so forth, they devised these training systems to eliminate the hesitation to take another life. And that became the video game.
And if you look, I think, Jose, is there another slide on video games? I think one or two more. Maybe I deleted. Oh yeah, yeah. So this again, it's a little bit old, but it's probably about the same today. The of video game genres, 26% are shooter video games, right? In terms of video games played and purchased, right? 22% is action, which is basically the same thing. So just to kind of get a sense of this, and you obviously see one of the effects in that in the really horrifying, deadly accuracy that completely untrained young people have in school and other public shootings, whether they were trained. Now, I just want to mention, Helga LaRouche did something really controversial about 20 years ago when she called for the banning of violent video games. And people who were around then remember there was a total, complete uproar around this. And actually, I was joining the LaRouche movement around that time, and one of my family members said, "You can't join that movement. Do you know they want to ban video games?" And there have been several other, Helga LaRouche is not the only one, and about, I don't know, it was maybe about 5 years ago, there was a lawsuit in California to ban the sale of the most violent video games to minors. And it was appealed and overturned on the basis of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, that this is art. Okay, so, but a lot of people don't play violent video games. What do a lot of people play? Right, they play games on their phones, right?
Oh, yeah, you see people they're playing the candy, what's the candy? Candy Crush?
Yeah. And people say, I don't play those violent video games, right? I play these innocent games like Candy Crush, it's the most downloaded mobile game in the world still. Right, it's okay. You're not sitting there on your phone practicing to kill people. Excellent, right? That's good. But these games are designed, and anybody who's played any of them or watched people play them, they are specifically designed to be addictive. That's the entire point, right there. That's why they exist, to be addictive. And they're designed based on the knowledge that we have from other addictive substances, drugs, alcohol, activities like gambling. They access the exact same neural pathways to give the body the same hit of dopamine as these other substances. What's the brain doing during these hours and hours and hours of mindless candy crushing or whatever's going on with these games? What state is the brain put into? And many studies have been done to show that when you are interacting with a digital device in that way, the neural pathways that are responsible for quote unquote deep thought, retaining and committing to memory, much more complex ideas, these are actually suppressed and shut down in favor of the more primitive action-reaction, short-term neural pathways. What happens to a young person who spends 55 hours a week doing that on their phone, right? Or an older person. Now, okay, so then there's the drug question. You want to pull up the next couple slides? So this is just, people may or may not be aware, many people may be aware that drug overdose deaths, which include both intentional and unintentional deaths, have skyrocketed over the past decade. So these are figures between 1999 and 2022, when you see a rise in almost all categories of overdose deaths, but especially synthetic opioids, which is mainly fentanyl, has skyrocketed. You can go to the next one. And this actually, I think I quote unquote knew this, I had heard this, but it shocked me when I started thinking about this. This is drug overdose deaths separated by age groups. This is in the United States. The blue bars are 2020 and the green bars are 2021. So if you look, the highest number of overdose deaths is happening in people ages 35 to 54 years. And you're like, okay, yeah, sure. But think about the significance of that.
those are the people who are in the most, supposed to be in the most productive periods of their lives, right? In terms of their contributions to the economy, to family, you know, to their families and so forth. So this is skyrocketed. So you think about what we're dealing with, especially with the rise of the legalization of pot and people defending the legalization of drugs as their freedom, something I do in my spare time. One figure I saw, I think it was on the CDC, I'm not sure if the study came from there, is that 16% of adults are self-reported pot smokers now. So 16% of adults are pot smokers, and of those, now I'm forgetting the number, I think it's 50% say they smoke every day. What's happening to your labor force, right? How many of those are your professors in universities, right? Or your kindergarten teachers? Yeah. You can go to the next slide. So what are we looking at with this increasing drug crisis and the defense of it by the people who are dying from it? This is Aldous Huxley in 1961 speaking to the Tavistock group at the California Medical School in San Francisco. He says in 1961, there will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. So that's Huxley. So we have accepted as a society a culture which deadens the mind, which traps people in their bodies, right? It traps people in the animal part of their being, in the prison of sense perception and the lowest emotions, the emotions we share with animals. Now the question is, what do we do? Now we're not the first society to deal with this. I think it's probably worse today than ever before in human history, but we're not the first. For example, Friedrich Schiller watched as the great promise and potential of the American Revolution coming to Europe completely fell apart in the violence of the Jacobin Revolution in France, and the hopes were crushed. And at the time, he said that while the objective circumstances were there, the moral possibility, the emotional and moral capacity of the population was wanting. And a great moment had found the little people. That kind of gets Mike to what came up a few minutes ago, right? Will the people be capable, even when the pressure's on? So if successful survival of the species depends on being able to make those revolutionary discoveries, to communicate them, implement them, to want to implement them, the most important aspect of an economy is the culture. Now, what if instead of rehearsing murder, whatever else, banality in leisure time, what if in people's leisure time they rehearsed the act of discovery? What if their minds were moving in the same mode and they were training their imaginations in the same mode as the great scientists? That's the purpose of art. So Friedrich Schiller wrote in an essay, it was a prelude to, I think, The Bride of Messina, one of his dramas. You can go to, right here. A writing called On the Use of the Chorus in Tragedy. He says this: art has for its object not merely to afford a transient pleasure. I'm going to start that over. Art has for its object not merely to afford a transient pleasure, to excite the momentary dream of liberty. Its aim is to make us absolutely free, And this it accomplishes by awakening, exercising, and perfecting in us a power to remove to an objective distance the sensible world, to transform it into the free working of our spirit, and thus acquire dominion over the material by means of ideas. For the very reason also that true art requires somewhat of the objective and real, it is not satisfied with a show of truth. It rears its edifice on truth itself, on the solid and deep foundations of nature. Now, how different is that from the conception of art that predominates in our culture today, right? The idea that art is whatever feelings I happened to, regurgitate onto this canvas, or this outburst I had that I put into lyrics. The idea that whatever sort of oozed, whatever forgotten pain or pleasure oozed out of you into some words or melody or something, that's art, right? And nobody can say it's not art because I felt it. Right? Has anybody heard that or thought that? I know I had many fights when I first started coming around with Rouge organization over that, over the idea that you cannot say that that's not art. Right? Somebody felt it; it was real. Now, for Schiller, and it's not just his opinion, this is true. Art is not art unless it's beautiful. If it's not beautiful, it can't ennoble the mind and the soul of the audience toward the divine. It can't raise them up above the level of the particular toward the ideal. And the interesting thing is Schiller says art can only accomplish that, uplift the individual, free this person in the way that he discusses in that quotation, if it stirs the mind to generate a concept freely of its own accord. You can't dictate thoughts. Art induces the other mind, the other soul, in a way, in a free way, a way that's similar to improvisation, to generate a particular concept, an intended concept. Now Schiller says that it can only do that if it addresses not the most specific and low-level aspects of human experience, my feelings, but the most universal. What is ideal in the human being? What is closest to the species character? So I wanted to look at an example, which people may or may not be familiar with. I know some people are. I just wanted to look at a particular poem and discuss it a little bit. And actually, I'm going to pass out two poems. One is the one I really wanted to read, but it's long and involved. So we'll save that for another day or later. So just take one of these.
Take one.
So
Here, I'll just pass it.
there you go.
There you go.
So while we're doing that, or before we do that, I want you to think about whether there is such a thing as a thought which is so precise that it can't be described, not directly. Is there a thought which is so precise that when you try to start talking about it, you've lost it? You know that you're not talking about it anymore. I don't know if anybody's had that experience.
I have.
New discoveries of principle are of that nature. When there is not yet language for them. So how do you communicate a new discovery to another mind? How can we use language, mere words, which are imprecise, to craft and communicate a thought in another person's mind, which is determined and precise? That's what poetry's for. So let's take a couple minutes and look at this poem.
You would do the honors, Robert.
On first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.
What's the subject of the poem? And first, looking at Chapman's Homer. Do you have a thought?
Well, I mean, that's what I was going to say is the title, but I mean, it seems that the subject of the poem is the likeness of a discovery that he made in the translation of the poem to these two metaphors, or maybe multiple metaphors of discovering a planet or discovering a new world.
I don't know what domain,
Domain, right?
domain?
It
Oh.
means domain. It might be pronounced demean. I mean that would rhyme with C, but it doesn't mean domain.
How ruled as his domain?
Ruled over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It makes sense when you add the line before it.
Yes.
I've been told of the expanse that Homer ruled as his domain.
Yeah.
So why did it take? I pose question. But like what you said is different than what the poem said, or what it's different than the poem, right? So there's something contained in the poem that's not contained in what you said.
Which is the poem.
Which is the poem, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason you can just be like, hey, I was so excited when I read Chapman's Homer. It was like, when you make a discovery of a new planet, it was like that. There's something inadequate in that.
The one thing that's quite incredible about it is that you don't, at least I believe this, but you don't need to read Chapman's translation of the Homer to get the idea, because the way he just expresses discovery is just so powerful. It transcends, you experiencing it directly, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because everybody can relate to the contrast in the first sentence there, where I've been here all my life, and I didn't see what I see now after reading. You know what I mean? I took it all for granted before then. I mean, you can't relate to that. And then, yeah, it's in that motion, that contrast.
And also, there's a meter change. So there's a change in pacing also. Did you pick up on that?
At some point, I'm hoping we'll get at least one more recitation through.
Okay.
I was just gonna ask if maybe you would recite it if you would like to.
I haven't got a chance to think about the last stanza yet.
I'll try it. I haven't really
Great.
rehearsed it, but I'll try, yeah, sure. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.
Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse have I been told Oft of one wide expanse have I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne, yet never did I breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.
So the interesting thing is, do we all have the same thing in our minds, or something different? I mean, there's maybe a time with a poem and you're just like, I don't know. But for people who were struck by it, or for whom it kind of made a whole, do we all have the same thought or a different thought?
Well, don't ask me that, I'm always right.
Well, I'll confess, I want to pick up a Chapman copy of Homer.
Is it that good?
Well, that's if Keats likes it, there's got to be something to it.
This isn't an answer to your question about how each of us might differently see the poem, but I know that my own mind, over time, once I maybe see these islands in person or something like that, I will see the poem differently later.
Yeah, that's true. It kind of reminds me a little bit of I think partly what we're dealing with is the difference between, like, when a scientific thinker makes a discovery, that thought, is it the same as what Einstein called the thought of God? Is it exactly the same? I don't think so, but it's close enough that we can wield power over the universe when we act on it, right? There's a resonance, there's something which resonates between that infinite universal truth and the human mind's embodiment of it that allows us to exert power over the physical universe.
I was gonna say that, yeah, just a blunter answer, which is, yes, I think that, yeah, we all do have relatively the same thought in our minds about the poem because we constructed it. I mean, we handed off one to the other, in relation to each other, right? In relation to this. I I mean, we reconstructed the poem in our minds. First from Robert to kind of to myself, I'd say, which we're all congruent with each other. That's what I'm trying to say. Everybody's thought was in congruence with one single idea.
So they're the
Going after
same, or
one
they're
single-
they're the same, they're congruent?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question. I don't claim to have an exact.
Could I make a kind of discovery that I think I made? He's talking, I think he's actually been to these islands, and then he never saw the islands in a way he did as when he read Homer speaking about the islands. Could that be?
It seems to be ambiguous,
Yeah.
because I think if you take the first lines at their ostensible claim, then you would say he is saying he has seen these islands. But then it seems that the poem is actually about discovering the world through language, and then it seems very ambiguous to me as to he might have never been to Greece, maybe that's why it's, whether or not he was in Greece in the physical world, he was definitely never in Homer's Greece. So he never saw what Homer described, even if he was there, right? Because it was a different world. So I don't think, to me, the ambiguity seems to be leveled against sense perception as the source of understanding.
And also what you were just referencing, how the mind must change as it realizes, oh, the idea I was building up, that's not where he was going. That's the really fun part.
Where was the meter shift you were talking about? I didn't catch
I
it.
think it's,
The meter
the
shift.
meter shift, I think it's after the colon.
Well, after the which? Cold?
After the loud
Yeah,
and bold.
so I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold.
Oh,
Then felt I like some watcher of the skies. It the pace changes.
Yeah.
oh, man.
There's a
You know, it's
definite-
kind of funny, this is not related, but this is, actually also the beauty of poetry. When I was reading this now, I was thinking of Martin Luther King's final speech, where he talks about, I went up to the mountaintop and God's allowed me, and he has this extraordinary vista that goes over space and time. He talks about going back to the Greeks, to Plato. He talks about being there during the Industrial Revolution. You know, he talks about, he even talks about FDR, you know, the president that says you have nothing to, the leader says you have nothing to fear. And he says, but of all those times, I would prefer to be here. And it just, she would say the poetry of it reminded me of that sort of image of literally flying over space and time and realizing that it's kind of all crystallizes where you see a whole new, you know, universe, or as he says, you know, a star or something, a star passing, or a new planet being discovered, or a new, you know,
Ocean. Yeah.
Area of the world that no one has ever seen, or nobody that you know has ever seen. So that kind of idea, it just, anyway, it's like a parallel. So when you say, gee, did all of us think of the same thing? I mean, we could say again, kind of empirically, oh yes, well, it's about this discovery of, but it's much greater because it unleashes a lot of these ideas, which are more profound, because everybody has a different experience or of it. It's similar, but it's a particular discovery, which has to be individual.
All right, let's hear from LaRouche on classical art. This is from a paper in 1999. The essence of all great classical art forms is a polyphonic interweaving of ironies, metaphor,
The essence of poetry is that words as such could not contain the meaning of ideas. Relative to any literal statement in words, no matter how sincerely those words are chosen, reality is always ambiguous. The mere words leave something important out. It is not the reality itself which is ambiguous, it is the literal use of words, which is always false to reality. Next. Classical art corrects the error to bring the idea corresponding to reality into the mind of the hearer, where the mere literal words could not. In poetry, as in all classical art, the artist uses ambiguities about the use of not only words, but commonly known ideas, in order to impart to the mind of the hearer a sense of the reality which literal use of words could never accomplish. The joy, not just of spending time living in that kind of world, but also as a shared experience of one's mind being moved by another mind. You recognize each other, right? And also doing it as a social experience, as we did in this room. Now, on the flip side, was a somewhat recent study done, published by Nature, and this probably won't shock anyone, that analyzed the melodic complexity of pop music since 1950, using the top 100 Billboard songs. And shock of all shocks, found that since 1950, the melodic variety and complexity has plummeted. Actually, and there was a turning point where it got worse and worse, starting in 2000, the year 2000. So Y2K and shortly before the Iraq War, right? So people might also have heard the thing, which is true, that if you know, I think it's like 4 or 5 chord progressions, you can play like any pop song in existence. Mm-hmm. So consider that. Consider the paucity of such a language. Can you generate, even if you wanted to, can you generate irony of the type that LaRouche was calling for or pointing out in an idiom or in a language which is so limited? Or maybe you ask, how limited can it get before you start to lose the ability to portray reality outside of or between the mere words? And I think, just to get back to the question, for us and the people that we're trying to organize and move in the United States so that we can avoid a nuclear war, is the way that people are spending their private time, is what they're occupying their minds with, just a private matter? Is it just their business, their own business, right? Is it really your right to do whatever you want in your time off? To get high, to listen to crappy music? Is it really your right? Along with that, I'll throw out the question, given what we heard from Schiller and LaRouche on the nature of art, the purpose of art, the job of art, can we measure the superiority of one culture over another? Is there a standard? Is there a metric? I would say yes. LaRouche said in his economics book, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, he says, in the context of defining potential relative population density as the measurement for mankind's power over nature, he says, we must measure the potential relative population density. This is the rough measure of the superiority of one level of culture over another. This is the measure of economic progress. So I think I'll leave it there. I could put some things on the table, but that's what I wanted to throw out for discussion.
Any questions for me?
Or thoughts?
Well, I'm just thinking of how brave you have to be to rock the boat these days. One time, LaRouche commented on the fall of the Soviet Union, and he said a big factor, maybe the biggest factor, was their ability to punish anything that rose above mediocrity. So,
Well, yeah, you look at how they punish LaRouche, right?
yeah.
I was thinking about some of the more provocative things you said, like art has to be beautiful. And it can only be art if it provokes the mind to be better. But like, who sets that standard? How can we know there is an objective standard if this was something that was created by people?
Okay, well, what principle, upon what principle are we all human? Is that just like, I mean, is that a law of nature? Is that, or did we just decide this is what, you know?
You mean when it comes to like what makes something art?
Well, in relation to your question, yeah, but
You mean like what makes us human?
is there, I think yes, a principle, which is the human principle, is that universal?
Yeah.
Okay,
It was our ability to reason.
okay.
Yeah.
And what's the nature of that? Like, what is the nature of the human mind? Is it, in art, you have the, art elicits great emotion. Is there a lawfulness to emotion and its relationship to that activity of reason, that ability to reason? Are they connected? Does beauty play a part in that?
I suppose so, yeah, but it's a question, like, well, I think to, like, Edgar Poe, The Cask of Amontillado, you know, the story about the guy who gets bricked up piece by piece and he's, like, stuck behind a wall forever.
Mhm.
What is beautiful about that?
I haven't read it in, like, I haven't read that one in
Or-
a long time, like, to be able to say specifically.
Or like The Raven, about a guy who's, like, going crazy and there's, like, a
But is that really the subject of it?
Right.
That might be the event, but is that actually the subject of what it, you know,
or
is
like
that the poem?
or like tragedies. Like last week, Dennis brought up Othello in the Q&A, and we often refer to Hamlet, and these are things that end in death.
But again, is that the subject? I think is the subject death. I mean, like, look at like today's TV shows. I don't know if you guys ever watch stuff sometimes just to see what's out there. Like, it's just death and blood and that is the subject of popular entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that was the subject of Othello, right? Death may occur in the play, or a violent act may occur in the play. But like, what is, like, in, you know, you think of, like, we talked about poems and then talked about the words of a poem, which are sort of the clothing we put on an idea so that we can see it, right? With our mind's eye or mind's ear. But think about, in terms of composition, think about the role that that event in the play plays in the course of the entire composition and what's being created between as the composition unfolds.
Right. I guess so. What I'm getting at is that like beauty, especially after what you just said, like with the words and his music are just the clothes we put on to actually get the beauty. Like, beauty is not just like happy, good feelings either.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm thinking like, yeah, if you just played Mozart Symphony 40, da, 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 you know, it's like happy and like, or like that stupid flute music. I'm sorry, I forgot you're a flute player. I apologize. You know, like
You mean
more.
hold music? That's the joke about flute music being elevator hold music.
My bad. You know, no hard feelings. I played clarinet growing up, so and it's an annoying instrument. The clarinet, not the flute. But it's not even just like tension or dissonance. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand. I know that these Shakespeare plays are meant to provoke you to not be tragic, like they often are. Like, hey, here's what will be the conclusion if you keep going this tragic route. And so I guess by that standard, then beauty is something that provokes you to act in such a way that is good.
I think so. I mean, there's an emotion of love, which is associated with beauty. It's the exact same emotion that's associated with discovery, like the joy. Like why? Like if you figure something out, even if it's in something simple like a geometry challenge, like you laugh either out loud or on the inside. You know, you laugh. There's a joy. There's an emotion of love in there. There's a certain passion, and I think it's the same. It's the exact same thing. And if you look at what composers like Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, what these composers were doing with the musical idiom, they were pushing the boundaries and stretching the limits of the musical language in a way that where the development unfolded in such a complex way that things which seem completely dissonant at their resolution you realize were completely lawful. And there's a total joy in that experience. So I bring that up because it's not all just like pretty sounds or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
It's not the sounds at all. It's the development that the mind is able to follow, and realizing at the end of in the silence at the end of the symphony or quartet or whatever it was, that it was all coherent. There was an intention guiding all of it. There was an intention behind it all.
It's certainly that's like when you listen to the late string quartets of Beethoven, especially the Great Fugue, and you're like, what am I actually? But then the way it ends and it resolves, like,
But it keeps going, right?
Yeah.
Like it keeps going. It's like we're not done yet, and it's not arbitrary. Like you look at what came in with the CCF, with the intention to create destruction of language and culture, with the atonalism, with the idea of, we've exhausted all the possibilities of tonal harmonious music, and now we're going to create something completely arbitrary and different. Dissonance for dissonance sake, right? The rejection of truth, the rejection of order, that there's something that the human mind will find universally beautiful because it's in coherence with natural law. The rejection of that, right? But that's not what we hear in the Grosse Fuge of Beethoven.
although there are parts that do sound very dissonant. Sometimes, well, I wouldn't say atonal, but yeah, the parts that definitely could confuse you a little bit.
Right.
And even the Grosse Fuge itself, and I know there might be people watching who have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's like the last thing that Beethoven wrote. And Stravinsky, who was part of the push for modern classical music, or the destruction of classical music, actually remarked that the Grosse Fuge was the first example of postmodern classical music. And that Stravinsky called it genius because it defies all convention of classical principle. You know.
Tells you how little Stravinsky understood, or how Stravinsky decided that he didn't understand.
Maybe he saw something we didn't. Yeah. Mm.
What's always amazed me is when after you're listening to Mozart, and you're in a concert, and I realize when they come to what you think is conclusion. It's silence. But if it comes in other music, all of a sudden people were clapping, whistling, getting all, but they didn't hear anything. But when it's of the highest ordering, it's silence. Then you give your appreciation, but it leads you to that moment of silence. In your mind, like, okay, I should give them some, praise. But I've seen both happen. And people just start, you hear it, but then others just goes, immediately and clap. There's no conclusion in their mind for whatever reason. I know what it means.
But I've been kind of cruising the poem, which I don't know if I may or may not have ever seen it before. I think it's clear that he's saying that his appreciation, I think what Dick said was right, that in the first stanza he's saying, I've traveled to these places, but until I read Chapman, I never saw what was so great. Or I never saw that it was so great. So yeah, I've just been reading over and over, and I think you're right.
Oh.
Hello.
That makes
What?
that makes it make more sense. Right.
The first, yeah.
Because he's like, I know I've been to these places that has been written about, but until I guess he says till I heard Chapman speak. But he's reading it, right? Isn't it? Like he's not listening to Chapman recite Homer unless.
I don't think so.
No,
Chapman
I
is
think
like
I
a
actually read this poem a while ago when I was reading a bunch of Homer, and I came across this, and then I read the Chapman, so I actually did the Homer by reading, like, since I don't read Greek, I did like 3 different translations, including the Chapman, which I didn't think was particularly good compared to the other ones.
You disagree with Keats?
But anyway, Keats and his friend got a hold of this Chapman, which I think had just been published, or they just got a hold of it, and they like stayed up all night, or maybe for like 48 hours reading and reading and reading. And he describes that compared to, because he had read Homer before in other translations, and this was completely different. It said it just opened up a whole new world in terms of what what Homer, it conveyed to him something essential about Homer and the poetry and so on. So I don't know, he didn't say, this was in some letters and stuff that I read, he didn't say what he had been to all these different places, but that was the key thing. It was a totally new vista.
Technically, maybe he wasn't there in person. The 4th line, he talks about the bards. Much have I traveled. He might be traveling there in his mind, kind of, because you have various bards. Yeah, what Lynn was describing, bards plural in fealty to Apollo. So perhaps there have been several writers who wrote about these Greek islands, and I read all of them, but not till Chapman.
The image that came to my mind at the second half when he says, like, until I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold, then I felt like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Right, so I guess he's looking up and he's like, oh, new planet. Or I really like this, or like Scout Cortez when with eagled eyes, he stared at the Pacific and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. Before I read the last line, I thought that they were just on a boat going along, and then there's like silence and they're all looking at each other because it's like, oh, they see land. They discovered something new. But I didn't understand silent upon a peak, and I don't know what Darien is.
Like the Darien Gap.
What is that?
Oh, where they discovered the Pacific.
Yeah.
Cortez was the first.
It's in between
European to see
South
the
America and Mexico.
There's like a presumption that we know quite a bit.
Yeah, I know,
just to
right?
read this poem.
I'm making
I'm
all
sorry.
sorts of discoveries. But you know, sometimes I do a bit of time reversal with this artificial intelligence. And I use artificial intelligence to say that Beethoven had a prescience of artificial intelligence, and he was saying a big no or an FU to artificial intelligence to say this is what humans are and how it's superior to artificial intelligence. That it's saying what's human. You know, I'm a human being, and that's why the drive that these great artists have they can't keep it in them. They have to, you know, they revolt against some degrading anti-human, anti-creative, I guess, anti-creativity or some fascism, you know, that it's some sort of fascism they force or imposition of somebody's will on their humanity, that they revolt against it, which is what this art is.
I get it.
Oh, good. He's my interpreter. Anyway.
Is there any other questions or thoughts?
I was thinking about,
We just had one person join, maybe would you read it one more time?
sure,
For our friend's benefit?
sure, yeah, so this is the poem that we were discussing, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Off the one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in daring.
Well, that silence idea was what I just thought about music, if it's come to a real conclusion, of Mozart or whoever. The silence.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Not like they're asking for more or anything.
Well, I was just relating to the idea of silence, like, there's really a tone shift there in those last two lines. Like, I think you need to,
Keep in mind in there.
I guess you would just recite it, you know, a lot. It has to be slower, I think, and it, you know, you really have to get this idea across, you know. You can't just, you know, bulldoze through it or something, but yeah, it's a very different tone, and you have to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is the question that Megan raised at the beginning of whether or not did we all have the same thing in our mind, or the same was what was happening in our minds the same for all of us after we finished the poem. But in the last lines, there's this culmination, and there is a kind of like reverential feeling that I think would benefit from being read more slowly.
Yeah.
Where everyone is looking at each other, presumably because they definitely all have the same thing in their mind, which is the vastness of the world and this unexplored potential, which completely exceeds their individual.
Yeah. It's like when you told the story about when they first saw the painting of Berea, right? I think it was something like they were so silent they didn't even know what to say to each other when
Yeah.
seeing this. So, it's kind of similar to that. You know, they're just looking at each other.
I think it also brings up a related question, which is with poetry recitation or musical performance, is there a right way? Is there a right performance? I mean, we all know, like, in the extremes, there are really bad musical performances. But, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, because there's so many different ways of performing it, and you can perform it in a different way, and it can still be beautiful. I think that's like one of the things about classical art. There's no one absolute way to convey it, you know.
But like what you were bringing up about what has to happen at the end, I think, I agree with you. There's something has to happen at the end in order to convey what I think Keats is demanding.
Yeah.
So I think it may not be, if you analyzed it like by microsecond, the same as someone else's, but that there has to be a certain ordering to the change that has to be kind of harmonious with how the whole thing's unfolded.
Yeah.
And if that's not there, it's not going to be right, I think.
So the right way is what gets the idea across, however that may be.
Yeah,
But I think it has
to
to
that. There are
change
limits
the,
to that.
it has to contain the ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because there's multiple meanings simultaneously, so
Yeah.
people are gonna pick up various things, like what Pam said. I didn't actually get it at the beginning, what you were saying about the silence and that, and the ending. That's actually very profound, and it is a musical idea. And that's how he chooses to end the poem. But the beauty of poetry is precisely the ambiguity. It's not, if you're writing something that's just gonna be didactic and straightforward, it wouldn't be a poem. It would be like what we said before, and he read Chapman's Homer, and that was better than all the other translate. I mean, that's kind of not the subject. I was just thinking, this is just an aside, but Mozart's opera, particularly I was thinking of the magic flute, but there are many examples of this, because there's all these characters that are relatively evil. I forget the guy that's trying to take off. Yeah, the guy that's trying to take Pamina off and so on. And it's just, he's so bad. I mean, he's evil. Or the Queen of the Night, for that matter. But the music is so beautiful, and it's very interesting that you have something. And I think actually Mozart actually said this at some point, that you can never have, you have to convey the idea of evil or ugliness, but it can't be ugly.
And I've seen queens that sings that song and they act out evil, and it just, even if they hit the high notes, it's just, it doesn't,
Well, the point is, the music is never ugly.
and they make it up to thinking they're doing it. Anyway.
Okay, so it's 7:35 now.
Yeah.
One time we have to stop. This is usually when we do stop.
Encore.
Oh yeah, we don't.
Can you respond to what I said though? Which was, I think the idea was, well, the right way being is whatever gets the idea across. All right, but I also, I had an original question, which was, I certainly have the choice of what to do with my free time, but what's the difference between the choice and not having the right to do what I really want? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's like two. So on the other thing, whatever gets the idea across is correct. I think that's true, but I think just based on the constraints of the material, like the sound and the meter of the words, and there are different things. In musical composition, you have certain constraints that are built into the material. I think there are limits to that. That sort of bounds you within a certain range of what's going to be correct, quote-unquote correct. And I think that's fun, because you're dealing with the physical material and the ineffable, the thought, and how those two merge and mix and affect one another. On the other thing, do we want to take arrest everybody who listens to pop music or something. And you can't, right? It wouldn't be as beautiful if people did it by compulsion, right? It wouldn't be as good. But that's the challenge, that's the paradox. We have to actually figure out how to make society good. Right? It's a little bit like what Leibniz, reducing it, but what Leibniz says about free will. Like free will has to exist because if the good is done by free choice, it's better, it's good than if it weren't, if it were done by, if you didn't have a choice to do it.
Well, yeah, I guess that is the challenge, because then how do you go from the Renaissance to today?
Yeah.
If at a point we were at a high cultural point, now we're not. How do you make sure that people always want to choose to follow what is most beautiful? I think you have to indoctrinate children. I think it's just that.
But I do too, but I think, look, I do, in the sense of expose them to as much beauty as you possibly can.
No, I think that's true. I had an interesting experience, I guess this is now about 15 years ago, when we were going around with.
I don't actually believe in indoctrinating children, by the way. For the record.
This is, we were going around with Amelia Robinson and she was talking to all different grades of kids, and, about the experiences in the civil rights movement, and she would ask them questions. This was her pedagogy, which is really good. And when you did the elementary schools, particularly first to, let's say, third or fourth grade, everybody was excited. Everybody wanted to ask questions. Everybody had ideas, the entire classroom. There was no dullards in there, or people who were not interested. Then when you got to middle school, it would just stop. You would see people, like she would ask a question and people would look around to their peers and they didn't want to answer because they would be identified as being, I don't know, intelligent or something. And it was horrible. Then when you got again to high school, but then it would be much, much less, and it would be special classes. You would, again, see a certain degree of creativity. So it was like in this middle period, all the creativity had literally been stamped out of people. And it was clear that this was cultural because it was always peer pressure. So how do you, and I don't know if that answers the broader question in terms of, the society's degenerating, but clearly this was a cultural issue. And these kids had been surrounded over this period with themselves, their peers, but just the society in general with banality. And really the opposite, the idea was that creativity was bad. This was, so it's a total reverse kind of phenomena. And that was a while ago. I mean, that's before cell phones and social media, which just reinforces it, in spades. What do people think about you? How many likes do you get? And, everything that we know. So that somehow has to be reversed.
And also, you think before you're 12 years old, your body and your mind is maybe more freer and could be if you had the family around. But when you hit 12 to 16, there's a moment of change, and you can't tell a 15 or 16-year-old what to do because they just immediately think they, know everything. And once they get out of that mind frame, if there's family to correct them of some poetry way, then I think I was a little bit more freer when I was 17, 18, 19, and I started to think different. But I think there's a very growth of the mind that's just not there when you're 12 to 16. But you're human, and you come in, and hopefully you find a subject you're interested in. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think the point is like children respond to beauty, to humor, to play, because there's something lawful. If there is something lawful about that that's coherent with human beings. It's not just like, oh, that's your culture and this is our culture, right?
Yeah.
I think that's why it's almost impossible, I think, to comprehend and wrap your mind around what it will be like when we don't have this dark age renaissance, you know? But if society can permanently overcome this kind of degeneracy and be in a completely different mode, where you don't have oligarchy anymore, and where the mode of existence is creative thought. Like, I think that's possible. I don't know when, but I think it's possible for the human species.
Okay, anything else? Okay, I'm just ending the stream.
Yeah, people should take a look at that other